understanding. And it's listening to this.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Barbara Boetta. I am the Executive Director for the Economic Growth Business Incubator. We are so happy to be able to bring this presentation for you all. I mean, child cares are a vital business and are essential for our Austin residents and our Travis County residents to get back to work. And so we need to make sure that our children are safe at your facilities. But upon opening up, it's kind of scary trying to figure out what do I need to do in order to keep my business safe. And so understanding your liability is key. And that's exactly why with our partners from the Texas Association for the Education of Young Children and our partners at the Rio Grande Legal Aid Clinic through LAMP, we are so proud to bring you this workshop for you today. Today I have with us Andrea Harrington, who is going to be visiting with us today and working with providing you with all the education that you need. Thank you so much, Andrea, for visiting with us and participating with us today.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here with you this afternoon.
Alrighty, they don't want to hear from me. So you all know, just a little housekeeping. Andrea is going to be giving her presentations at the end. We'll be doing a Q&A, so we want to make sure we answer all of your questions. Please, if you have questions, please put them in the comment section, and I promise I will get to them as soon as she's finished with her presentations. And we won't stop until we answer all of your questions. So Andrea, let me pass it over to you.
Okay, great. All right, good afternoon. So today we're going to be talking about child care centers and liability concerns. And for those of you that are the owners and operators of child care centers, this of course extends not only to the children in your care, but obviously to your staff and to any parents and guardians that are coming in and out of your centers, as well as any other invitees like music teachers, custodial staff, licensing staff coming out to make inspections and the like. So we're going to cover the larger considerations as you move in through these reopening phases. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. So just as a brief introduction of myself and what we're hoping to accomplish today so that we're all on the same page, I have been working at Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid as a small business attorney for the last 12 years or so. And we provide free legal services for eligible micro enterprises, small business owners, of a transactional nature, which means that if you need assistance setting up your business, if you need assistance with contracts, that is something that we can help you with. If you are having issues where you are either being sued or someone is suing you, that is something we can definitely point you in the right direction, but that is not the type of case that we would normally take in-house at the Micro Enterprises Project. But what we do, as well as assist with transactional matters, is provide a lot of community legal education. And that is what we're doing today. And so I want to make sure that we are on the same page and that we are covering the larger general principles of law and recommendations that are going to apply to most of you most of the time. And this is intended to give you all the knowledge and the tools to know when to ask more questions and to recognize when you may need to engage an attorney to assist you with particular issues. So I'm happy to stay after and answer any questions you may have. I do encourage you to be thoughtful about the questions that you're putting out on a public forum, and in thinking about your question, making sure you're not disclosing any confidential information about children, protected health information about that you may possess. My contact information is on this presentation on the last slide. So if you do want to speak to me in a more private setting, then you can absolutely call me or email me, and we can move forward in that way to make sure that you do get the information that you need in order to make good decisions for your business. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. So before we talk about how to manage the liability for reopening in a pandemic era, I want to make sure that we're on the same page when we talk about what liability actually is and what it means. And the reason we want to cover this is because I have found in my practice that 90% of the time what a lawyer is talking about when they talk about liability is not what the person, the business owner, is talking about when they talk about dealing with liability. So I want to make sure we're on the same page and make sure that you guys have a really good idea of what an attorney is thinking when you say the word liability to them. So let's cover the liability basics. Next slide, please. Okay. So liability is a legal construct that means that you're responsible for the harm suffered by another, okay? And the most common example of this construct that we all encounter in everyday life is when we're driving our vehicles, right? So if you get in your car and you go to the grocery store, you go to work, you go to the park, there's no way to guarantee that you won't get into a car accident, right? In the same way, there's no way to guarantee that you're not going to be sued or that an accident of some sort is not going to happen in your business. So you cannot avoid or prevent liability. I've had clients sometimes tell me, well, I want to do X, Y, or Z so that I can prevent liability. And there is no way to do that, just as there's no way to prevent getting into a car accident when you're driving. You can do things to manage and reduce your risk of liability. And when we go back to our example of driving a car, things that we can do to manage our liability are, for example, to get car insurance, right? That way, if you do get into a car accident, you know that the insurance is going to pay for any damage that somebody else may suffer as a result of that accident if it's deemed to be your fault, okay? There's other things we can do to reduce our risk of liability, right? So these are engaging in risk mitigation behaviors, like not texting and driving, right? Not drinking and driving, driving the speed limit, right? These are all things we can do to reduce our risk. So those are the types of practices that we are analogously referring to when we talk about risk mitigation, about following best practices, so that you can manage and reduce your risk of liability. So as we move forward through our conversation today, please remember that there's no way to avoid or prevent liability. It is something that exists that you can manage, okay? There's no way to guarantee that you won't be sued, right? Any person has the right to go to the courthouse and file a lawsuit. Now, your actions in managing liability may give you a valid defense, but again, short of standing in the courthouse doors and blocking the way, there's no way to prevent someone from suing you, okay? And similarly, because of the nature of this pandemic, there's no way to guarantee that you're not going to have an incidence of infection or exposure at your place of business. If you're open, that possibility is there. And what we're going to talk about is how to manage that possibility and reduce the risk to your business in that eventuality, okay? There are a couple of ways that people and courts look at liability and at your liability as an individual or as a business. So one, you may have liability under contract. And that means that you are responsible for the things that you agreed to do in that contract, right? So if I sign a lease agreement or a purchase agreement where I am purchasing goods or services, then under the contract, my liability is in the payments I agreed to make, okay? Then there's also liability under common law. So as individuals in a society, we all have the obligation and the responsibility to have a reasonable amount of care towards each other, right? And so you can have liability under common law due to something that you do, due to your actions. So if I get in my car and I am texting and driving and I rear end someone, then I am responsible for the damages to their car because of my actions of texting and driving, okay? You can also have liability because of your omissions, right? So if I know that my 16-year-old child has taken the keys to my car and is driving around and they don't have a license and they don't know how to drive and I don't do anything to stop them, then I can be responsible for any actions because I didn't do anything, right? Because of my omissions, my failure to act. So there's a couple of different ways that these lapses in responsibility towards the people around us can come back in a form of liability. And we're going to talk about how you set up your business in a way to minimize the potential for you to be held liable under contract due to actions or due to omissions. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about a little bit further about the kinds of liability that exist, okay? So there's vicarious liability, and as business owners, the most common scenario in which you would be exposed to this is if your employee does something in the course of their employment. You are responsible for your employees' actions within the course of their employment. And so that would be vicarious liability, all right? Strict liability, this is not really going to apply to you guys, but basically if you produce any products and the product is defective, you are going to be responsible for the damages caused by that product, period. So that is something, again, that's not really applicable in your scenario, but it is a type of liability that is recognized under the law. Tax liability, I hope that you all don't have to deal with this, but you are responsible for reporting and paying taxes, and tax liability extends to taxes that you didn't know about. And so if you have employees and you didn't know you were supposed to be paying employment taxes, that's not going to excuse your obligation to pay those taxes, all right? And so this is where we hear, this kind of refrain that ignorance of the law is no excuse. And so we want to, this is why this education, community legal education is so important, so that you all have the information you need to move forward in a way that's going to be protective of your business, okay? We talked about contract liability. And then finally, we have tort liability. And this is the area that's going to be most at issue when we're talking about pandemic issues, right? Because tort liability includes things like personal injury, which is what we're all worried about if somebody gets sick. And again, this is going to be the responsibility. If you do something, you may not be intending to hurt someone on purpose, but if due to your actions, someone else is injured in some way. So those are the kinds of liability that are out there, and obviously there's different strategies to manage this liability that you can utilize in your business, and we'll go through those. But I wanted to give us kind of a basic vocabulary that we can share and still be on the same page. All right. Next slide, please. Okay. So the first and most effective way to manage liability is to have insurance. This is going, and frankly, this is often the cheapest way to manage lots and lots of different kinds of liability that you may encounter. So I really want you all, if you don't have insurance, to look into insurance, because it can be very protective of you in terms of paying out claims that that may arise. Next slide, please. So the big thing, though, and this is where people get in trouble and insurance gets a bad rap, is that it's critical that you know the terms of your insurance policy, okay? Because if you have an insurance policy that is not going to cover the kinds of risks that you face in your business, it's not going to do you any good. And you're going to be paying premiums for things that are not a problem for you, okay? So you need to know the terms of your insurance policies. Really important, you need to know what property and what events are covered, all right? So for example, if as part of your daycare operation, childcare operation, you do pickups and drop-offs, you need to make sure that your insurance policy covers the vehicle and the drivers that are doing those pickups and drop-offs, because that's a big area of risk for your operation. And if you just have, for example, property insurance or general commercial liability that covers your space that you've rented, then you have a huge uninsured risk. So again, really important to know what property and events are covered. Just as critical is to know what is not covered, okay? To understand what the exclusions are. In commercial insurance policies, really common exclusions are damages due to pandemics, riots, civil unrest. So if you want that kind of coverage, then you need to make sure that you talk to an insurance agent to see if it's possible to get that added on. If you do get that added on, there will be an additional cost. But I'll give you some examples of where this lack of understanding of insurance policies has led to huge problems. So for example, most travel insurance policies do not cover cancellations because there's a pandemic out there. And a lot of people who were traveling when all of these lockdowns started to happen lost money on trips because pandemic is an exclusion in most of these policies unless you're actually ill, right? They'll cover you if you come down with an illness, but not because of this external kind of amorphous thing. So again, really important that you understand your insurance policies and that you review them if you haven't already, okay? The other one that I want you guys to look at and think about, particularly if you haven't opted into the workers' comp system, is workers' comp, okay? Workers' comp can provide coverage to your employees. It'll partially cover lost wages. It'll cover medical expenses for employees that get ill or injured in the course of their employment. This also limits the employee's ability to sue you for personal injury or for a dangerous workplace. So this can be, especially if you are really worried about exposure. For example, let's say that your child care center has been, traditionally used by the children of your clients or medical professionals who are going to be at very high risk for exposure, putting the entire family at high risk for exposure. Workers' comp may be something that is a good thing for you to consider moving into your budget if you haven't already done so, because you may have a little bit more elevated risk for your staff than a center in a different situation. Now, a workers' comp also has exclusions like any insurance policy, and it's really important that you're aware of what those are. So, for example, workers' comp, and this is the one that gets the most confusion, disappointment, whatever you want to call it. But workers' comp is only going to provide benefits to your employees. And this is your staff, your teachers and caregivers. It does not provide coverage to independent contractors. So if you have staff that comes in and they're contractors, you give them 1099s, you pay them by the class or whatever, that come in and provide an additional service like music lessons or art lessons, they are not going to be covered by workers' comp. All right. So again, that's an exclusion that you need to be aware of. Okay. Next slide, please. All right. So let's talk about managing liability with contracts. We talked about some contract liability. Contracts are also really useful for managing liability. And we can go through that. Now, there have been a lot of questions about how you do this, and I want to talk to you about not just the legal pieces of it, but also some of the business considerations. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about liability waivers and releases. First things first, there are a couple of basic requirements that liability waivers and releases have to meet in order to be enforceable at all. One, it has to give fair notice. So it has to say that you are releasing me from something from my negligent actions. And you actually have to use the word negligence in the release, okay? They have to be conspicuous, right? That means they have to be clear, unequivocal, and very, very visible, all right? So using bold print, capital letters, different color font is going to make that release pop and be conspicuous, all right? Courts have found that releases that are placed on the back side of a contract or that are in teeny tiny font are not going to be enforceable in court. So just really be aware of that. And you cannot use vague, deceptive, or confusing language in the release. You have to be very specific as to what you are including in this liability release. So you have to specify the specific and categories of risks or potential injuries that you were talking about. So if you've been leaning towards the idea of using a liability waiver for people dropping their kids off because you don't want to be responsible if they contract COVID-19, then that needs to be specified in your release. It cannot be confusing. I like to tell people that on the liability waivers, you have to use the grandma test. If your grandma would not understand the liability waiver, it's probably not going to be enforceable, okay? It has to be clear, it has to be conspicuous, and it has to be in very specific language as to what is happening if you sign this document, okay? All right, next slide, please. Okay, now let's talk about what these words in the liability waivers mean. When you're talking about being released from your own negligence, negligence means the failure to use reasonable care. Reasonable care is what a normal, prudent person would have done in the same situation. So, for example, negligence may be, I thought I buckled in the car seat correctly, but I didn't double check it. And I got an offender bender, and the child, that I was transporting was injured. Okay, that's negligence. Gross negligence is the conscious and voluntary disregard of the need to use reasonable care. That would be in the same scenario. I didn't bother to buckle the kid in at all. I just plopped the toddler into the seat. I didn't buckle them in. I didn't check to make sure the seat was properly installed, and I just took off, okay? Now, Texas courts do not agree as to whether gross negligence waivers are enforceable. So generally, I don't include gross negligence in the waivers that I draft because that guarantees an appellate fight, which is more expensive than most of my clients can ever afford in the first place. And in the second place, it's not clear that they're going to be enforceable at the end of the day. All right. The other thing that you guys need to be aware of is that in Texas, the courts will not enforce waivers signed on behalf of children by their parents. Okay? So if you say, you're signing a liability waiver so that if your child gets injured, then I'm off the hook, that may prevent the parents from suing you for, emotional distress or for loss of companionship or whatever the case may be, but that is not going to prevent the child from suing you once they turn 18 or even, before they turn 18. So parents cannot waive tort liability on behalf of their minor children. We see these waivers all the time anyway. I have to sign one, every time my children play sports. The fact of the matter is, though, that Texas courts decline to enforce these. So just be aware of that. Ultimately, when you look at the totality of the circumstances for your business, this is going to be a business decision. So if the only reason you wanted to use the liability waiver was so that parents would know that if their kids got sick, that they couldn't sue you, this may not be worth the friction it'll cause with your client group because it's not enforceable, right? So I just want you all to really think about what liability waivers require, what the underlying law is in terms of liability waivers for children, and how you think that your clients will react to those documents as you make these decisions, okay? There still are situations in which liability waivers can be useful. They are useful in disclosing risks to the folks who sign them, particularly if it's a well-drafted liability waiver. They can be useful in discouraging someone from filing a lawsuit. But at the end of the day, if you're in a knockdown, drag-out court fight over a liability waiver, you need to know the bottom line of the laws that govern these. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the other thing we see often are called indemnity agreements. Indemnity agreement means that the person who signs that is saying, look, even if you get in trouble, I'm going to take care of your damages. The most common kinds of indemnity agreements that we'll see are in your commercial leases, where the owner of the property has the tenant sign an indemnity agreement. So what this means is if somebody comes into your place and they trip over a loose brick and hurt themselves, they may sue you, they may sue the property owner who should have fixed that loose brick. But because of the indemnity agreement in your lease, you have to defend not only yourself, but also the property owner. The agreement means you're holding the property owner harmless for any damages, any attorney's fees that arise from the incidents covered in the indemnity agreement. These can be useful for when used in conjunction with release type language for minors. And so what that says is, look, I'm telling you that if you do this, there's a chance your child can get hurt. And you agree that whatever happens, if the child gets injured, that you are indemnifying the child care center for any of those injuries, right? And those can be enforceable because it's a contract between two adults. So just, be aware of that. The issue with indemnity agreements, and again, this is going to be a decision that you take looking at your client group and at what you have set aside for legal fees, basically, is that there are collection issues. So if the indemnity agreement says that the parents are going to indemnify the center for X, Y, or Z, are you really going to go after these folks to collect this money? And even if you do they have the money to pay it, right? So again, think about some of the practical implications of these contracts. But again, they are useful in terms of setting a tone, setting an agreement, laying out the risks that people are assuming in coming into a child care setting, in allowing you and your staff to pick up and drop off kids from school, et cetera, et cetera. So just be aware that these tools are out there. They are useful. They are not the be all and end all to, build a giant castle wall between yourself and your center and potential liability. Okay. All right. Next slide, please. Okay. So let's talk about reopening. All right. Some of you may not have opened yet and are just looking at how to reopen. Some of you may have gotten permission to stay open as an essential business since all of this kind of hit the fan in March. But I want to talk about some of the best practices that we want to make sure are happening so that you can manage the inevitable liability of opening in a pandemic, of being open in a pandemic, particularly in a child care setting. All right, next slide, please. Okay, excuse me. So let's talk about your policies, procedures, and training. Many of you probably already have illness policies. I know the child care centers that I've used, we've always had the fever policy. You pick up if your child has had, X, Y, or Z symptoms, et cetera, et cetera. I want you guys to take a hard look at those policies and procedures in the light of this new pandemic. So develop really detailed policies for illness, okay? Especially because children sniffle and cough and are snotty, probably 90% of the time. It's just part of childhood. And so you want to develop some objective standard policies that are going to apply to everyone. You want to have policies for pickup and drop off. These are times when you may find it really hard to enforce social distancing, either because of, everyone's going through the same hallway, or everyone's trying to get in and out of a small parking area, or you're having to hand off an infant, from person to person. So think about how that works. You may have parents, drop off an infant, step 3 feet away. The caregiver comes in 3 feet, picks up the infant in their car seat. You may decide that the parents are going to come in and set an infant down in a crib or in a bouncy chair or something of that nature, and then step away and the caregiver can come in. So think about what makes sense for you in your center in terms of pickup and drop off policies, okay? You also are going to need to have new policies and procedures for sanitization and cleaning of not just your equipment and facilities, but also think about in the category of your equipment, all of the toys and utensils and other items that the children are going to be touching and probably mouthing for the younger groups. You don't have to make this up from whole cloth, right? We want to look at published guidelines, and I've in the materials there are links to some of those guidelines. You also want to do things that are realistic for your center. Okay, this is not a invitation for kind of these pie in the sky procedures that you cannot comply with. One thing that I can't stress enough is that it is important for you to comply with your own safety policies. If it's going to be really easy to prove negligence or gross negligence in court. If you have policies saying that you should be doing X, Y, and Z and you don't do those, because then you're not following your own safety guidelines. So if something is just not center, don't include it, okay? Include the next best thing that is possible for your center. Again, these have to be individualized, realistic plans. Factor in the cost and availability of the supplies you need to implement these plans. So, if hand sanitizer is really hard to find, you may be implementing hand washing because you just can't find hand sanitizer. Or you may be asking parents to bring hand sanitizer. So just think about what that looks like for you, okay? The other thing as you go through these policies and procedures that we want to be really careful about, particularly because so much of this has to do with illness, is that you have to be really careful that you are not requesting confidential medical information that you don't need, and that you are not disclosing confidential medical information, right? This is your PHI, your protected health information on that belongs to staff, that belongs to any parents, guardians, or children, or any contractors that may be coming through your facility. Okay. COVID-19 issues intersect with a lot of employment laws and privacy laws. So if you have someone with disabilities that has COVID-19 concerns, you need to make sure that you're not falling afoul of the Americans with Disabilities Act in terms of figuring out how to integrate that person's concerns into your new policies, procedures, trainings. The same thing for folks that are a little bit older and in higher risk groups. There is the ADEA, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of age, starting for workers ages 40 and over. And then, the HIPAA and the Texas Medical Records Privacy Act is going to protect confidential, basically all medical records are considered confidential and protected under those two laws. And then the CARES Act, the FFCRA, does give people paid leave. So if you are, if you are thinking about all of these issues, you want to make sure that you are keeping in consideration the laws that, other than the FFCRA, but the laws that have been in effect for some time and how they intersect with this new pandemic that we're facing. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Disclosures, notifications. This is where you can really make sure that you, your staff, your clients are on the same page in terms of what you can do to reduce risk, but also to have everyone understanding that there's no guarantees and that you are aware of this and that they are aware of this. Okay, this is in the legal world is talking about having an assumption of risk by other individuals. So in participating in, in the center's operations as employees or as clients, these individuals are assuming the risk of potential exposure to the novel coronavirus. And you want to be really clear about what you are doing and what you're not able to do and what the risks are, so that if there are any problems down the line, this there is no question that everyone was on the same page in terms of the risks that they were taking in participating in center operations. So the disclosure is super important, right? You want to disclose your procedures that you've come up with and how you're implementing those, both to your staff, because they're the ones who are going to be actually responsible in carrying this out, as well as to your clients, okay? Because your clients are going to have to make decisions about whether or not they are comfortable in coming back as well, okay? There are some unavoidable risks, and I encourage you all to either in a reopening letter, in an email, in a parent packet, however you best communicate, but it orally as well as in writing, that you disclose the unavoidable risks that are out there, right? So that you tell your clients, look, there is asymptomatic transmission of this novel coronavirus. People can be infectious and giving off viral particles before they have any symptoms of illness. So because of that, there is no way for us to guarantee that that will not happen here. All we can do is respond to symptomatic individuals and send them home, but the day before they disclose symptoms, they may have been shedding virus, and there's nothing we can do about that, okay? Again, kind of sharing the CDC guidance on what are the high-risk factors for severe illness, and letting people know that if they or their children have those high-risk factors, that they really need to consult with their medical professionals, with their doctor or pediatrician, in terms of whether or not returning to care is a good idea. And certainly let them know that you're happy to share all of your cleaning protocols and what you can do to try to keep those types of high-risk individuals safe. But again, disclosure is really important, because there may be some things that, because of your resources or the size of your center or the configuration of your space, you're just not going to be able to do. So you just want to make sure that you're sharing information, and again, really important, being realistic. Don't make promises you can't keep, okay? Okay, then you want a notice and acceptance of these disclosures by these individuals. So you really want to get signatures back that they have received these documents, they have reviewed the documents, they are accepting the risks in sending their children, in them showing up in person to do drop-offs and pickups, and that they are agreeing, again, to share, if they're symptomatic, that they're going to make sure that you are aware of that so you can take protective measures for everyone else, okay? Really important. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about how we use these tools to manage your risk, okay? And the big thing you're going to want to do here, you're going to want to stay up to date. Things are changing very rapidly. CDC changes their guidelines from time to time. HHS may put out new guidelines for centers. Just yesterday or the day before, here in Travis County, we changed the risk status from stage 3 to stage 4. So you want to make sure that you start your day and you end your day keeping one eyeball on the news, so that you know what's happening in your community, and then making sure that you're following any guidelines that are required. So make sure you're up to date on what HHS says that child care centers have to do per your licensing. as well as what best practices are out there, because there may be some ideas that you can implement that will help make your center a safer place. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about employees. Best practices, and this is generally recommended across the board for all employees, is that if you have employees coming in, you need to have PPE that you can provide, which is your personal protective equipment, okay? And training on how to use it properly, right? So for childcare centers, we're talking masks, we're talking gloves, particularly at any diaper changing stations and any bathroom stations with children that are either potty training or that are so young that they need assistance in the bathroom, and potentially smocks for caregivers of infants that may be spitting up, crying, or getting discharge from their eyes or their nose on the caregiver's clothing. So smocks may be something that can be PPE for those folks. Illness policies for specifically to your employees. Excuse me. So that may be daily screenings or questionnaires. How are you feeling today? Are you feeling, extra tired? Have you been coughing? Do you have a fever? That kind of thing. If you can get your hands on one of those touchless thermometers, you can implement daily temperature checks. And then think about your leave policies, right? With the CARES Act, you will get tax credits against your payroll taxes for providing paid leave to employees who are sick with COVID-19. So you may want to implement those. You may want to think about whether you require a doctor's note, especially if at this point it's hard to get those because people aren't going in as much. They're doing more telemedicine. Leave policies if someone is ill in the household. So maybe your employee isn't sick, but their spouse has a suspected COVID-19 case. You may want that person to stay home rather than coming to your center, okay? So those illness policies are going to be really important. And then flexibility for returning employees. There may be other tasks that you can have employees do other than interact with children. They may be able to do some back office work, or now that cleaning and sanitizing is so important, you may be able to direct some time into doing that. So think about how to be flexible, especially in terms of the extra work that the sanitizing and cleaning process will be creating. Along with this illness policy, you want to think about what you're going to do if there is a case of COVID-19 in your child care center, and how you're going to notify staff and parents or guardians. Obviously, you cannot disclose the name of the person or kind of identifying information of the person who tested positive or who has a suspected case of coronavirus disease. But are you going to close? Are you just going to close that wing of the building? Are you going to, how are you going to sanitize? Do you have a sanitization company on the ready that can do that? So think about what that looks like, so that if that does happen, and it may be a case of when that happens, right? Because it's still fairly widespread community infections, that you have a plan in place that will reduce the amount of time that you have to close in order to make sure everything is clean and safe again, okay? Really important, because we talked about vicarious liability, is that the teachers and the caregivers get training on these new policies and know what's expected of them. Make sure these are mandatory staff meetings. You'll have to pay them for this, and make sure that they sign in that they have attended these meetings and received these trainings. The other thing that's got to be a part of these is you have to explain the consequences of failure to abide by these guidelines and what that discipline is going to look like. Is it going to be immediate termination? Is it going to be one warning and then termination? Again, this is going to be really important for you to think about, but you have to be clear and direct that if, for example, a employee is not wearing a mask, they're not going to be allowed to work that day. Or if they don't change their gloves between changing diapers, they can get fired. Whatever your policies and your discipline for failure to comply with those policies is going to be, you need to make sure that your employees are very clear on what this new pandemic workplace looks like, okay? Because that's going to be there for their own protection as well as for that of the children. All right, next slide, please. All right, so for parents and guardians, you want to make sure you're communicating the pickup and drop-off policies, okay? You know, so what is there going to be social distancing? Are they going to be walking children in now? Or is it all going to be drop off in the parking lot and a staff member will come and bring the children in? Are there going to be health screenings, temperature checks for the children? Be really clear on what the new policies look like to parents and guardians. Are you going to be requesting that parents provide extra supplies for their children? Extra clothing, right? So whereas pre-pandemic, you know, an infant who, you know, had a crying fit might stay in the same onesie. Now, you know, any kind of bodily fluids is going to result in the child being changed, right? So that may require more extra clothing. A parent's going to be providing extra wipes, snacks, food. What is your food program going to look like now? Are you going to require masks for children? Obviously, those need to be age appropriate. And at this point, I believe there shouldn't be any mask for children under the age of 3 or 4. And it's, you know, as the mother of a 7-year-old, I can tell you it's really hard to get the younger children to keep them on and to stop touching them. So you really need to think about what that looks like and what is going to be realistic for the children that you care for. Okay. We've talked about, you know, illness policies. The same kind of thought process needs to go in for the new policies for your clients and their children, as has gone into the policies for your staff. All new pandemic-inspired changes need to be communicated to parents. If you have a parent contract or a parent agreement, that needs to become an addendum to that parent contract and agreement so that they read it, they agree to it. It becomes part of your normal kind of onboarding documents as you reopen, okay? The other thing we want to think about, and as you go through the published guidelines, which are in the materials, or the links to them are in the materials, is think about what are going to be your I'm dying on this hill policies versus what are recommendations. So, excuse me, there's a lot of policies or policy recommendations that only one parent do all the drop-offs and the pickups because it reduces the amount of social contact, right, of different people coming into contact at the same place. As a realistic thing that happens in the world, that may just not be possible, right? The parents' work schedules just may not allow for it. So you want to think about what, obviously there's lots of best practices out there. Not all of those are going to be possible for all centers. So really think about what's going to work for you and your parents, okay? Think about how you communicate with your clients, with the parents, as well as your staff. How are you going to communicate unexpected occurrences to parents? Let's say that you get a call that a child has tested positive or a staff member has tested positive or somebody who came in and did the cleaning, your cleaning crew tested positive for coronavirus disease. How do you let your people know this? Do you have a Facebook group? Do you have a text chain, a phone chain, email? How are you communicating with your folks? Because the last thing you want is to have a contaminated building and have people showing up at 7 a.m. to drop off children because they hadn't seen your Facebook post or because it wasn't clear how you were going to reach them to let them know you were closed. So make sure that communication piece of it, is going to be very clear to parents, so they know to be checking those communication channels fairly frequently. Okay. All right, next slide, please. All right. So your facilities and equipment, this is where, we really want you guys to work with your small business counselors, either at EGBI, through the SBDC or other organizations in town like SCORE or Big Austin or whoever, City of Austin, whoever the case may be, because I think that most of you are going to need to do some budget adjustments. And on top of being closed for so long, it's going to be a challenge. One is you're going to have to obtain and provide adequate cleaning and disinfecting supplies. One challenge on that already is finding reliable sourcing for that, okay? And to adjust your budgets to accommodate for those extra expenses, okay? You may need to adjust budgets to accommodate higher utilities, right? So if we are washing hands 10 times as often as we did before, if we're opening an hour earlier, closing an hour later than we used to because we're doing an entire facility disinfection every night, all of that is going to factor into these higher bills. And I don't want anyone taken by surprise by higher operating costs. I want y'all to be thinking about it right now. Okay. And again, think about how that affects your scheduling, how that affects the amount of time that caregivers have to get things done, like to lay out lunch, get the kids fed, pick up lunch, get the kids down for nap. When you're adding in hand washing, PPE changes, et cetera, that may make the schedule a little wonkier than it used to be, okay? The other thing, excuse me, is adjusting the use of your space. You may have to space out cribs, nap mats, high chairs out further than they used to be. You may be having to split up groups that used to be together to kind of reduce the size of these kind of caregiving pods. And so think about what your space is going to look like before you reopen so that you can make those adjustments ahead of time. Think about what that looks like for outdoor play. If you're going to be outdoors a lot more than you used to be, you may want to invest in some shade equipment if you need it. So think about those costs as well. All right. Again, adjusting the use of equipment and toys, right? So the recommendations are to, get rid of all the plush toys because they're extremely difficult to sanitize. So if you have a lot of plush toys, that's something to think about. Think about what you're going to do with toys and equipment in the infant and toddler groups, where we tend to get bodily fluids, saliva in particular, all over everything because they are going to put things in their mouth. And what does that look like in the new toddler room in a pandemic era? And again, as you're thinking about, the recommendations on plush toys, a related category is what are you going to do with blankets, with dress up costumes and imaginative play toys that are often shared and passed around in that way. For example, hats and not PPE masks, but masks that children use for imaginative play. All right. So all of that you need to go into your center, look around and really think about and reimagine what these rooms are going to look like. Okay. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, you don't have to make this up whole cloth. There are lots of published guidelines that you can look at to help you think through this. It's a lot of material, and I do want to make sure that you guys have those resources. So if I can go to the next slide, please. There's federal guidance that the CDC and OSHA have put out, and I think these are really helpful. The CDC guidance for childcare is really thorough, and I think can help spark, your imagination about what is and isn't going to be something you can do and work for your center, and may really get you thinking about issues or items that you hadn't thought about before as you move through the reopening process. OSHA is going to provide a lot of good guidance on what you need to do in order to ensure that you're taking as many steps as possible to ensure your staff safety. Next slide, please. Okay, the state guidance. So the governor of Texas, when he published the reopening guidelines, there are some guidelines that are specific to child care centers, and he's got a checklist out there. So that's really helpful, as is the guidance from HHS, which you all should be familiar with as it is your licensing agency. But again, I just wanted to make sure you all had these links so that they could be easily accessible for you. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think at the end of the day, hopefully this checklist here of reviewing, selecting, and implementing is going to be a helpful guide in getting you through this process so that you can manage your liability in terms of reopening in this really unprecedented time for small businesses. So the first thing you want to do is really look at all the guidance that's provided. I mean, take some time and read through what's been published. Some of it is not going to apply to you. Some of it is not possible for you, either because, again, of the layout of the physical layout of your space, of your parking lot. It may be that you're only running infant care, or you only do toddlers and up, or you only do after school care. So again, some of it's not going to be relevant, but I think that when I reviewed it, it was thorough enough that I think it will hit on issues that you might not have thought of, okay? Secondly, out of all of that guidance, really look at not only what you think is a good idea, but what is logistically and financially possible for you to implement, okay? And that is what you can do. Again, you're only setting yourself up for a bad situation if you write down and publish policies that you cannot meet, okay? So you want to follow your own guidelines, okay? As I mentioned earlier, just the nature of these guidelines, the nature of additional cleaning, sanitization, and PPE requirements are going to require you to really take a hard look at your budget. There's going to be new line items in there, and there's really there's no way around it in terms of the additional PPE in particular and cleaning products that you're going to need to invest in. So really take a look at that and consult with the experts in business that you have on your team to, really take a harder look at your business plan, take a harder look at your budget so that you can implement as many of these changes that you feel are going to be helpful. Once you've got your policies and procedures down and you've done this internal evaluation, now it's really critical that you train your staff and you communicate with your clients, with your parent groups, so that there is a very clear understanding between all of these stakeholders in your business about what the risks are, what you can do to mitigate those risks, and the remainder of the risk is something that everybody has taken upon themselves when they're either returning to work, returning to drop their children off, et cetera, so that you all can be on the same page. So I know I went a little bit over, but we can do Q&A now. And then on the very last slide is my contact information for those of you who may have additional questions. So I'm happy to answer any questions folks have.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Very helpful information. We have a few comments. I'm sorry, a few questions. And if those of you that are online have some additional questions, please feel free to post them in the comment section. Jason is wondering, when you were talking about insurance, he's getting some feedback that the insurances aren't willing to cover, to activate pandemic coverage. And this is something that you and I have talked about also. Do you have any updates regarding this?
No. So it's going to be really hard, I think, to find someone willing to cover pandemic-related damages in the middle of a pandemic. That's like trying to get flood insurance when the hurricane has made landfall. Okay. That being said, if you had insurance prior and you think that the insurance company is denying your business interruption claim unfairly, make the claim, get the denial, file the appeal, and hang on, because there is a lot of litigation that is winding its way through the courts on that specific issue. But at this point, I would be surprised if there's an insurer that is going to issue pandemic coverage during a pandemic. That being said, I mean, pandemics have happened before and they'll happen again. So, given your experience with this, I think it is a good idea, once you're able to kind of get through this emergency, to really think about resilience planning for your business in the future, whether from a pandemic or from any other, potential disaster that could befall your business.
Definitely. It's extremely important. And this is the time when we can also make change by following your guidance. Lila was a little clear. Can you clarify what the virus exclusion is on commercial policies?
Well, there's lots of different kinds of commercial insurance policies. So if you're talking about the business interruption policy, some insurance companies do have exclusions that include pandemics, which is going to be either viral or bacterial. Some have exclusions that include contamination, and actually that there is litigation over that word, contamination, whether that includes viruses, or because in the past that was used to refer to stuff like pollution. Or Superfund sites, businesses that were affected by those types of issues. But again, there's not a standard insurance policy. Every company writes their own, so it's hard to say universally what the exclusions are on all commercial insurance policies.
Gotcha. And for those of you that are online, what I want you to make sure everyone understands is that if you registered for today's workshop, later on this week, we will be sending you the link. And I encourage you all to review it again to make sure you understand childcares are an important part of our community. We need you, but we also need you to be protected. And then when you get it, share it with your other colleagues. We are stronger together. So this is a perfect example. So Shannon, we will be sending this link out. It will also still be available on our Facebook page. I appreciate that. One of the things that Leah asked regarding when you were talking about the training and the policies is, where can we find these materials? Where can we find examples of liability waivers and how to train? Where can we find these?
So I would start with the published guidance. Those are a good place to start drawing from in order to get your policies together. Okay. the sample policies that are out there already don't cover pandemics because, it's been 3 months since this became kind of a real life issue for us. So I think that going to these guidelines, the links that are in the slides are going to take you to places and to documents where you can start pulling that language in order to craft those additional policies. If you don't have any policies whatsoever, then there's certainly childcare model policies out there. But again, those aren't going to cover pandemics. And if you need some of those, I'm happy to pull those. But the materials reference and give links to supplemental policies that should form the basis for your pandemic reopening policies.
And then, Andrea, a question that hasn't been asked yet, but one thing that I know with our business coaching is we have a lot of clients that say, I don't know what to follow. There's so much information, and you listed the CDC, the OSHA, the state. As a small business owner, especially if I have something, my child care center is at my home, what do I follow? Where do I start? How do I protect my business?
So I think an easy place to start. So OSHA is going to apply only if you have employees. So if you work at home, if your child care operation is a home-based child care center, you're not in a commercial space and it's just you don't have employees, don't worry about OSHA. Okay. OSHA it gives you guidance on the employer's practices and obligations to keep their employees safe in the workplace. Okay, so you can not worry about that. I would say I thought the most digestible set of guidelines came from the governor's office. I thought it was a good place to start. It was easy to read. It's only 8 pages long, but it contained a lot of information. And I think it's the perfect document just to kind of get your mind going about what you might want to do. From there, I would jump over to the CDC guidelines. That's a lot more stuff, okay? That's pages and pages of links that you can rabbit hole down. But I think that is a place to go for you to find policies and guidelines that you can it's so much that some of it's not going to be applicable to you, but you may find some things that are perfect for your specific business. Okay, so I would say start with something that's, start with the appetizer and then move on to the main meal and take it slow. And finally, obviously, do not disregard anything HHS says, but I am assuming since you guys are all child care centers and child care providers that are licensed, the HHS stuff is not something that's going to be new to you, okay? Because you're getting that just as a license holder.
So someone that has employees, they need to look at the OSHA guidelines.
Yes, absolutely. Because you have an obligation to provide a safe workspace.
Okay, perfect. One of the things that a lot of you also have is you have the resource called the Texas Association for the Education of Young Children. That's a great way to have that resource. And I know they're having meetings regularly. They're also being your voice to your local and your state government. So definitely make sure you're reaching out to them as well. EGBI is here. We are here to help you provide help figuring out your budget. Those of you, if you have received recently maybe the payroll protection program or idle funding, and you're trying to figure out how can I make that money stretch, EGBI is offering free coaching to you all to help you get through this pandemic. One of the things that I want to make sure everybody online understands that there is help for you. And Andrea may not have all the answers and I may not have all the answers, but one thing that we can do when you reach out to us is we can mobilize, and we can, I call it, call the troops in and get the answers that you need. So if you have questions, I'm going to put your information one more time, Andrea, on, here's Andrea's email, aharrington@trla.org, and here is her phone number. EGBI, we are here to provide training, coaching, and support to aspiring and existing businesses, and we're doing this to help you all grow and be successful and continue to make an impact in our community. So please feel free to reach out to us. We have one last question before we sign off for the afternoon. Our preschool is part of a church. Are there any resources that we need to take into consideration because of the shared spaces?
Yeah, I mean, and that's that situation is going to require coordination with whoever you're sharing space with. If you have separate budgets, you're going to need to talk about who's going to be responsible for cleaning and the costs of that cleaning, when that's going to happen, what those standards are. Excuse me. It may be that you have an agreement that works for you. It may be that you're so far apart on what those standards may need to be that it may make more sense to hire a third-party sanitation company and you each pitch in, so that there's no dispute about how, when that gets done. But it's gonna be a discussion you're gonna have with the other groups that are sharing that space, particularly if they're high-risk groups. If you're sharing a space with a retired person's activities group, that's going to be much more of a concern than if you're sharing a space with, another youth group or a scouting troop. That may not be as high a risk group. So yeah, absolutely find out who is sharing that space in case you don't know, and have conversations with the managers or the leaders of those groups so that you all can continue to use that space in a way that maximizes the safety of all of the individuals that are coming in there, and that you can be on the same page in terms of, remember we talked about disclosures that are going out to all of the participants. So if there is, a lot of elderly people in there doing crafts on the hours that the preschool is not in there, those folks need to know that there were a bunch of kids running around licking the tables, an hour before they got there. So again, it's all about those conversations. And this is new. I mean, we haven't seen this in this country in about 100 years. So all of this is new to everyone. So I don't want you guys to feel like you should know what to do. Nobody knows what to do. We are all working together to move forward and get everyone back to the place that they need to be. And that's why those conversations are important, to get on the same page. So hopefully that's helpful. But again, I encourage any of you all to contact me if you need assistance, and we can move forward through the process to opening up a case for you at Legal Aid. The other thing, just to build on Barbara's comment earlier, is that there was an announcement yesterday from SBA that the EIDL and the PPP loans were reopened again. So, for a while you couldn't get an EIDL loan unless you were an agricultural operation. But now they're open back up to everyone. And the PPP loans, there's still money there. And I think that whatever confusion and issues there were with the PPP loans, if you're reopening now, this is the time to get one. Absolutely. Because it helps you with your payroll while you're open, which is much less problematic than, having received the loan back when everyone was still shut down. So really talk to the EGBI counselors to see if you haven't already done this to reevaluate, because the forgiveness standards have also become much easier to comply with, which is great news. So.
Well, thank you, Andrea. We really appreciate it. We are going to do this workshop again in Spanish, so in 7 minutes. So if you have somebody that you want to share this link with, we're going to be right back. Like I said, in 7 minutes, doing this in Spanish. This is important information that Andrea, thank you so much. You're sharing with us. Thank you to the Texas Association for the Education of Young Children for helping us spread the word. Please, we are here for you. And I wish you all a great Wednesday and stay safe. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Andrea.